There is a broken piece of limestone in a museum in London, and it is one of the strangest objects to survive from the ancient world. It is not beautiful. It is not gold. It is a fragment, cracked into pieces, the kind of thing that would draw no attention at all if you did not know what was written on it. And what is written on it is this: a royal name, carved inside the oval ring that Egyptian scribes drew around the names of kings. But the carving is not original. Someone came to this stone after it was finished, and took a chisel, and cut out the name that was already there, and put a different name in its place. And the name they cut out was the name of Nefertiti, Queen of Egypt, and the name they put in was the name of a king. Sit with that for a moment in the quiet. A stone that once said, "The great royal wife Nefertiti was altered deliberately, so that in the place where her name had been there now stands a royal titulary, a throne name, the full formal apparatus of a pharaoh." Somebody, working in Egypt some 3,300 years ago, took a queen off a monument and put a king in her place. And the question that has haunted Egyptology ever since is very simple and very large. Were they the same person? Because a ruler does appear, in exactly these years, at the very end of the strangest period in Egyptian history, a ruler with a throne name of her own, a ruler who is written about, in some inscriptions, with the grammar that Egyptian scribes used for women, not men. A ruler who carries an extraordinary phrase attached to her name, a phrase that appears nowhere else in the whole long roll of the pharaohs, and which means something very close to effective for her husband, a king with a husband. And she arrives on the scene at almost precisely the moment that Nefertiti, the most visible queen who ever lived, disappears from it. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand this question as fully as it can be understood: whether Nefertiti, the great royal wife, ended her life not as a queen but as a king, ruling Egypt in her own right, wearing the crowns and carrying the titles of a pharaoh. You will understand what the evidence actually is. Piece by piece, the altered stone, the throne name, the feminine grammar, the strange epithets, the objects in a boy king's tomb that were made for somebody else and then taken back. You will understand the case for it, made by serious scholars over many decades. You will understand the case against it, which is also made by serious scholars, and which is not weak. And you will understand where the argument stands tonight, and why it may never be settled, and why it matters so much. This is not a story about a queen. Egypt had many queens, and some of them were powerful, and a few of them are remembered. This is a story about something far rarer and far more disruptive: a woman on the throne of Egypt as a king. Not a king's wife, not a king's mother, not a regent holding a seat warm for a boy. A king, wearing the titles, carrying the throne name, counting the years of her reign as her own. Egypt did that perhaps 4 or 5 times in 3,000 years. It was not impossible. But it was rare enough to be remarkable. And every single instance of it left a mark, and every single instance of it ended in some kind of trouble afterward, and in almost every case the men who came later tried to scrub the woman out of the record. That pattern is worth holding on to tonight, because it is going to explain a great deal about why the evidence looks the way it does. And here is what makes this particular case so extraordinary. Nefertiti is the most photographed face of the ancient world. She is on posters, on book covers, in a glass case in Berlin with a queue of people in front of it every day. She is famous for her beauty, for that long neck and that level gaze and that tall blue crown. And what almost nobody in that queue knows is that there is a serious, live, decades-long scholarly argument about whether the woman they are looking at ended her life ruling Egypt outright, sitting on the throne of the pharaohs, in a period so violent and so confused that the men who came after took chisels to the walls and cut the whole thing out of history. We are going to spend this long night inside that argument, and I want to be honest with you at the outset about what kind of night it will be. This is not a story with a clean ending. The evidence is broken and scarce, and much of it was deliberately damaged by people who wanted it gone. Scholars of the highest reputation look at the same fragments and reach opposite conclusions. What I can promise you is that we will look at every piece carefully, that we will give the strongest form of both cases, and that when we do not know something, we will say so plainly rather than dressing a guess up as a fact. Because the truth, when the evidence is thin, is not that we should stop asking. It is that we should ask more carefully. And there is a reason to care about this, beyond the simple pleasure of a puzzle. If Nefertiti did take the throne, then she stands in a tiny handful of women who ruled the greatest kingdom on earth in their own name. And she did it not in a time of stability, but in the wreckage of a religious revolution that was already collapsing. with an empire fraying at the edges, with her own daughters dying around her, with the priests of the old belief massing to take back everything her husband had torn down. She would have taken the throne, if she took it, at the worst possible moment, holding an impossible position. And she would have held it briefly, and lost it, and been erased. That is a very different story from the one printed on the postcards. That is not a beautiful queen. That is a woman in a burning house, picking up a crown. There is one more thing worth saying before we begin, and it concerns the peculiar way this puzzle has to be solved. We are not going to find a document that says Nefertiti became king. No such document exists, and none is going to turn up, because if it ever existed, the men with the chisels would have destroyed it first. What we have instead is indirect. A name that used to be one thing and was altered into another. A grammatical ending on a word that should not be there. An epithet so unusual that it appears nowhere else in 3,000 years of Egyptian records. A piece of jewelry in a boy's tomb with somebody else's name, still faintly readable, underneath his. These are not the sort of clues that shout. They whisper. And so the work of answering this question is not the work of finding a treasure. It is the work of reading very small things very carefully, and of noticing what has been removed. Much of what we will be doing tonight is looking at absences, at the shape of a hole in the stone, and asking what used to fill it. That is a strange kind of history, and it requires patience, and it rewards it. It also, and this is important, requires humility. Because when the evidence is this thin, the temptation to make it say what you want is overwhelming, and the history of this particular question is littered with brilliant scholars who fell in love with a theory and made the fragments fit. We will try not to do that. When a piece of evidence is genuinely ambiguous, we will say so, and we will leave it ambiguous. So tonight, let us go back. Let the modern world fade away, the way the light fades off the water at the end of a long day. Let the centuries roll back, past everything you know, to the 14th century before our era, to a city in the desert with the sand already starting to blow across its painted floors, to a king dying, to a kingdom coming apart, and to a woman standing in the middle of it with a decision to make. Let us look very carefully at what she did next, and at whether we can ever really know. Before we begin, if you find ancient Egypt as fascinating as we do, take a moment to like the video or subscribe. It's a small thing, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. To understand the question we are asking tonight, we have to understand two things first. We have to understand what kingship actually was in Egypt, and why a woman holding it was such an enormous thing. And we have to understand the particular moment, the particular collapsing world, into which this question drops. So let us build both, slowly, before we go anywhere near the evidence. Let us begin with kingship, because most people, hearing that a woman ruled Egypt, imagine something like a queen in a European sense. A woman who inherits a throne, wears a crown, sits in a court, signs documents. That is not what Egyptian kingship was, and the difference is the whole point. In Egyptian belief, the king was not simply the most powerful person in the country. The king was a role in the structure of the world itself. He was understood as the point where the human and the sacred met, the one through whom order was maintained against chaos, the one whose rituals kept the sun rising and the river flooding and the grain growing. The Egyptians had a word for the order he maintained, and that order was not merely political. It was cosmic. It was the way things were supposed to be, and the king's job, his central and unavoidable job, was to hold it in place. And that role, in every image and every text and every ritual for 1,000 years and more, was male. The titles were male. The regalia were male. The iconography of kingship, the striding pose, the false beard, the smiting of enemies, all of it was built for a man's body and a man's grammar. The Egyptian language itself made it awkward. The words and the verb forms that went with kingship carried male endings, and to put a woman inside them you had to either break the grammar or bend it. So when a woman took the throne of Egypt, she was not simply doing an unusual job. She was stepping into a shape that had not been made for her, and the whole visual and verbal apparatus of the state had to be adjusted around her, awkwardly, visibly, in ways we can still see. And that awkwardness, that grammatical strain, that mixing of male titles and feminine endings, is precisely the kind of trace that scholars hunt for. It is, quite literally, how you spot a woman on the throne of Egypt from a distance of 33 centuries. The language cracks around her, and the cracks are visible, and 3,000 years later, we can still see exactly where they run. Hold that thought. It is going to matter enormously tonight. Now, it had happened. Egypt was not a place where a woman on the throne was unthinkable. It was a place where it was rare and difficult and generally followed by trouble. There had been a woman, centuries before this story, who took the throne when there was no male heir, and whose reign ended in some kind of crisis we can no longer see clearly. And there had been, most famously, Hatshepsut, only a couple of generations before Nefertiti, who began as regent for a boy, and then at some point stopped being a regent and became a king. Not a queen, a king. She took the full titulary. She was depicted in the male regalia, with the false beard. She ruled for something like 2 decades, and she ruled well, and she built magnificently, and Egypt prospered under her. And when she was dead, they came for her memory. Her images were smashed. Her name was chiseled out of her monuments. Her statues were broken up and thrown into a pit. Somebody, some years after her death, set out systematically to remove her from the record of Egypt's kings, and very nearly succeeded, and it took modern archaeologists, digging her shattered statues out of a pit, to put her back where she belonged. Now think about what that precedent means, sitting in the mind of anyone in Egypt in Nefertiti's lifetime. A woman had taken the throne, within living memory of their grandparents. It could be done, and what had happened to her afterward could also be done. Both halves of that lesson were available, and it gives us a template, a model, for exactly what we should expect the evidence to look like if Nefertiti did the same thing. A brief reign, poorly attested, followed by a deliberate and thorough erasure, leaving behind precisely the kind of broken, altered, half-legible, endlessly arguable material that we do in fact have in our hands. That is not proof of anything. History does not work by analogy, and the fact that one woman did a thing does not mean another woman did it. But it is a very good reason to look very hard indeed at the scraps that survive, and to be slow about dismissing them, and to remember whenever the evidence seems maddeningly incomplete, that incompleteness was somebody's deliberate achievement. Now let us build the second thing, the moment, because the world into which this question falls is not a stable one. It is a world in the last stages of an experiment that has failed. Picture Egypt at the height of the Amarna period. The king, Akhenaten, has done what no ruler of Egypt ever did. He has turned against the beliefs of his own ancestors. He has closed the ancient temples. He has ended the worship of the whole vast multitude of figures the Egyptians had revered for well over 1,000 years, and declared that only one thing gives life to the world, the disk of the sun itself, which they called the Aten. He has walked away from the ancient capital and built a new city in the empty desert, on virgin ground, and moved his entire court and government into it. And beside him through all of it stands Nefertiti, elevated as no queen of Egypt had ever been elevated. Shown at his own scale, which in Egyptian art was a statement about power. Shown in crowns that no queen had worn, including one tall, flat-topped blue crown that appears to have been made for her alone. Shown driving a chariot. Shown performing worship by herself, without him. Shown on one astonishing block raising a mace over a bound captive in the oldest and most exclusively kingly pose in all of Egyptian art. Look at that list again, slowly, item by item. The equal scale, the crowns, the chariot, the solitary worship, the mace over the captive. Every single one of those things is a step toward kingship, not toward queenship, which had its own perfectly well-established imagery and did not include any of this. Toward kingship. And they were carved in stone, publicly, on temples and monuments, over a period of many years where anyone who could read an image could see them. Now bring in the collapse. In the 12th year of the reign, there is a great ceremony, the last bright moment, the tribute of the empire heaped before the throne, the whole royal family present. And then, almost at once, the deaths begin. A daughter dies, and the grief is carved into the rock of the royal tomb in an image so raw that Egyptian art has no precedent for it. Other daughters vanish from the record. Something is killing the children of this house. Outside, the empire is fraying. Letters come from the vassal cities of the north, written on clay, and we still have them, and they are pleading. Enemies are pressing. Cities are falling. Send troops. Why do you not answer? And inside Egypt, invisible in the monuments but absolutely present, are the enemies the king made when he closed the temples. Thousands of them. Priests without temples, officials without offices, whole populations whose livelihoods ran through institutions the king had shut down. They have been waiting, patiently and in silence, for 17 long years, and their patience is about to be rewarded. And they know, as everyone knows, that the entire structure of the new belief depends on the life of one man. And there is a boy. Somewhere in the royal household, in these years, a son has been born. and he is almost certainly not Nefertiti's son. The evidence points to another woman of the royal house as his mother. He is very young, a small child, and he is the only male heir in sight. Now hold all of that in your mind at once, because this is the room in which our question is asked. A dying king, a collapsing religion, an empire calling for help, a city in the desert with no reason to exist except one man's conviction, a queen who has been raised over years to the very edge of kingship, and an heir who is a small boy of perhaps 6 or 7 years old, far too young to hold anything at all, and probably not her child. Somebody has to hold the throne. Somebody has to stand in that place and do the things a king does, or the whole structure, in the Egyptian understanding of the world, begins to come apart. And there is, in that palace, in that terrible year, exactly one adult who has spent 17 years being shown on temple walls performing the acts of a king. That is the situation, and I want you to feel the weight of it, because the debate we are about to enter is not an abstract puzzle about inscriptions. It is a question about what a person did in a genuine emergency. If Nefertiti took the crown, she did not take it out of ambition in a time of peace. She took it, if she took it, because her husband was dead, the heir was an infant, the empire was slipping, and the enemies of everything they had built were coming. And there is one more piece of the world we need, and it is a strange one, and it will matter more than anything else tonight. Around the time Nefertiti stops appearing in the record, a new royal name begins to appear. Actually, 2 of them. There is a ruler called Smenkhkare, who seems to be a king and who is shown with Meritaten, Nefertiti's eldest daughter, as his great royal wife. And there is a ruler called Neferuaten, who also holds a throne name and who appears, from the grammar of certain inscriptions, to be female. Now look closely at that second name, Neferuaten, because it is not a new name, it is Nefertiti's name. When the court moved to the new city and the new belief was proclaimed, the queen's name was extended and deepened and bound to the sun disk, and the fuller form of it became Neferuaten Nefertiti. That first part, that Neferuaten, had been hers for years, carved on walls throughout the kingdom, and now, at the very end, a king appears, bearing that name. That is the shape of the puzzle. A queen, raised for years toward kingship, disappears. A female king, bearing her own name, appears. And every serious scholar who has ever worked on this period has had to stand in front of that coincidence and decide what to make of it. Some have concluded it is decisive. Some have concluded it is a trap. Nobody has been able to ignore it. Let us dwell, before that, on what the crown actually was, because if we are going to talk about a woman taking it, we should be clear about what she would have been taking. Kingship in Egypt was not an office you were elected to, or a title you inherited on paper. It was a transformation. When a person became king, they took a new name, or several. They were understood to have entered a different category of being, and with that came a set of duties that were not optional and not symbolic. The rituals in the temples, performed by the king or in the king's name, day after day, which were understood to keep the whole machinery of the world turning. If the ritual stopped, in the Egyptian understanding, the world stopped. The order that held back chaos was not self-sustaining. It had to be maintained, actively, forever by a king. So when the throne was empty, the Egyptians did not merely have a political problem. They had a problem at the level of the world itself. Somebody had to be doing the rituals. Somebody had to be holding the order in place. And when a king died, leaving an heir who was a child of 6, the question was not merely who governs. The question was who holds the sky up. That is the pressure inside the room. And it is why the idea of a queen stepping forward, at the death of a king, into the role of king, is not as outlandish as it might sound to us. It is not ambition. It is triage. Let us dwell first, though, on Hatshepsut a little longer, because she is the closest thing we have to a template, and the parallels are worth drawing carefully. Hatshepsut was a king's daughter and a king's wife, and when her husband died, she became regent for a boy who was not her son, a stepson, a child far too young to rule. And for a few years she did exactly what a regent does. She held the seat, and then, at some point that scholars still argue about, she stopped holding it and started sitting in it. She took the throne name. She took the full titulary of a pharaoh. She had herself depicted with the regalia of a king, in the striding pose and in some images with the ceremonial beard that was part of the costume of kingship. And notice what she did not do. She did not pretend to be a man. That is a very common misunderstanding, and it is worth clearing away, because it matters for how we read the evidence tonight. Hatshepsut's inscriptions frequently use feminine grammatical forms. She is described, in places, with the endings and pronouns that belong to a woman. She was not disguising herself. She was doing something far more interesting and far more difficult. She was occupying a role that was defined as male, openly, as a woman, and letting the language strain around her. That is the fingerprint. When a woman holds the throne of Egypt, you do not find a woman pretending to be a man. You find a male institution wearing a feminine grammatical ending, and the mismatch is visible, and the scribes clearly did not always know quite what to do with it. Remember that, because it is precisely what we are about to find in the inscriptions of the female king who appears at the end of the Amarna period. The same strain, the same cracks in the grammar, the same institution bending. But before we do, let us slow down and take a much closer look at three things we have just skated past, because each of them is load-bearing, and if we do not understand them properly, none of the evidence tonight will land the way it should. The first is the co-regency, and what it was for. Egyptian kings, from time to time, made their sons kings alongside them while they were still alive. Father and son would rule together, each counting his own regnal years, both wearing the crown, both appearing in the inscriptions. This was not a division of power in our sense. It was an insurance policy. The most dangerous moment in the life of any monarchy is the moment when one ruler dies and the next has not yet taken hold. That is the moment when the throne is empty, when rivals move, when the palace guards can be bought, when the whole edifice can come down. So the solution was elegant. Do not let the throne ever be empty. Crown the heir before you die. Then when death comes, there is no gap, because there is already a king standing there. Now, why does that matter for us? Because it means Egypt had a mechanism, an established, respectable, well-understood mechanism, for creating a second king during the lifetime of the first. The machinery existed. It had been used before, and it means that if Akhenaten wanted to elevate somebody to kingship alongside him in his final years, he did not have to invent anything. He simply had to use the tool that was already in the box. And it raises the obvious question, and it is the question that has kept scholars awake for a century. If you were Akhenaten in the 16th year of your reign, with your daughters dying and your empire fraying and your only son a small child, and you knew you did not have long, who would you crown? The second thing we need to understand properly is the name itself, because it is the single most important piece of evidence in this whole story, and most retellings rush past it. When we say that a female king appears bearing the name Nefertiti, we need to be precise about what that means, because Egyptian royal names were not like our names. A pharaoh had a whole set of them, several, each with its own function. Two of them were written inside those oval rings we call cartouches. There was the birth name, the one you were given as a child, and there was the throne name which you took when you became king, and which was, in a sense, your identity as a ruler. The female king we are discussing has both. Her throne name is Ankheperur. Her other cartouche carries Nefertiti. And here is the crucial detail. That second name, Nefertiti, is not an invention. It had belonged to Nefertiti for years. It was the name she took when the court moved to the new city and the new belief was proclaimed. It was carved on monuments up and down Egypt with her face beside it. So the female king is not merely a woman with a similar-sounding name. She is a woman bearing, as one of her two royal cartouches, a name that we know for certain Nefertiti carried. That is not proof of identity. Names could be shared. Nefertiti had a daughter who bore the same name, a younger Nefertiti, and that daughter is a candidate too. But it is a very large coincidence, and coincidences of that size are exactly what a careful historian is obliged to take seriously. And the third thing we must understand is the erasure, because it explains the state of every scrap of evidence we are about to handle. When the Amarna period ended, the restoration was not gentle. The old belief came back, and it came back angry. The temples of the sun disk were pulled down, and the blocks were carried away and dumped as rubble inside the walls of other buildings. The names of the king and his family were hacked out of the stone, and in the official lists of kings that later Egyptians compiled, the whole period simply is not there. The succession runs from the great king before Akhenaten straight on to the restoration, as though the intervening years had never happened. When later scribes had to mention that king at all, they did not name him, they called him the enemy. Now understand what that does to the historical record. Every ruler of that period was scrubbed, and if there was a female king among them, she would have been scrubbed twice over. Once for being part of the heresy, and once for the ordinary reason that Egypt had always found ways to remove women from the list of kings. Look at what happened to Hatshepsut, and she had been perfectly orthodox. So when people say, as they sometimes do, that the evidence for a female pharaoh at the end of the Amarna period is thin, the correct response is, of course it is. It was made thin. on purpose, by people with hammers. The thinness of the evidence is not an argument against her existence. It is exactly what her existence would predict. And yet, and this is the discipline we must hold on to through this whole long night, the fact that the evidence would be thin if she existed does not mean that thin evidence proves she existed. That is a trap, and it is a seductive one, and it has caught better minds than ours. Absence of evidence is not evidence in either direction. It is just absence, and we must work with what remains. Now let us go and look at the evidence itself, piece by piece, and see what it actually says. So here we are, at the heart of it. Let us lay the evidence out on the table, piece by piece, and turn each piece over slowly, and see what it says and what it does not say. We will take our time, and when we have looked at all of it, we will build the case for, and then the case against, and then we will see where we stand. The first piece is the broken stone in London, and it is where we began, and it is time to look at it properly. It was found more than a century ago in the ruins of Amarna by one of the founding figures of scientific archaeology in Egypt, a man named Flinders Petrie. It is a private monument, not a royal one, the kind of thing an ordinary well-off person might have set up in a shrine in their own house. It is broken into fragments, and it shows a scene of the royal family in the familiar Amarna manner, the king, the queen, a daughter, seated together under the rays of the sun disk. Scholars call it, now, the Couragency Stela, and that name is itself an argument, so let us be careful. Here is what happened to it. When it was carved, it showed 3 figures, and the names attached to them were Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their eldest daughter Meritaten. Ordinary, a family scene, of a kind we have hundreds of, and then somebody altered it. The name of Nefertiti was cut out, and in its place was carved a double cartouche, the paired oval rings of a king bearing a full royal titulary, a throne name Ankheperur, and a second name Neferneferuaten, with an epithet attached. And the name of the daughter Meritaten was cut out too, and replaced with the name of another daughter, Ankhesenpaten, the third daughter, the one who would eventually marry Tutankhamun. So on this one broken stone, someone has taken a queen and turned her into a king, not a different person, standing somewhere else on the monument. The same figure, in the same seat, in the same family group. The woman's name has been removed, and a king's titulary has been carved into the whole. And here is the thing that makes it so hard to explain away. The figure was not recarved. The image is still the image of a woman. It is only the name that changed. So we are looking at a monument on which a female figure, unmistakably female in her body and her dress, is labeled with the 2 cartouches of a pharaoh. That is the single most direct piece of evidence we have, and it is worth sitting with in silence for a moment before we start arguing about it. Somebody who lived at that time in that city took a chisel to a household monument and updated the queen's name to a king's name, which means at the very least that somebody in Amarna believed that the woman in that picture was now a king. Now let us take up the second piece, and it is the name itself, and here we must be patient and precise, because this is where the whole case lives. The female ruler bears a throne name, Ankheperur, and here is the first strange thing. That same throne name, Ankheperur, is also carried by the other shadowy figure of these years, the one called Smenkhkar. 2 rulers sharing a throne name. That is odd. Throne names were supposed to be individual, and 2 successive kings using the identical one is close to unheard of. And here is the second strange thing, and it is the one that cracked the case open. Sometimes, in the inscriptions, that throne name is not written as Ankheperur. It is written as Ankhetkheperur. The difference is a single letter, a feminine ending, the mark that Egyptian scribes used to signal that a word applied to a woman. The throne name of a pharaoh of Egypt, written with a feminine ending. Let that land for a moment. There is no honest way around it. Somebody, writing officially, in the formal apparatus of the state, was recording the throne name of a reigning king of Egypt, and adding a feminine grammatical marker to it, because the person who held that name was a woman. And it gets stranger, because attached to her second cartouche there is an epithet, and epithets were normal, and kings had them all the time, and they usually said things like beloved of some figure or other, or chosen of some power. Hers, in several versions, says something quite different. It has been read as beneficial for her husband, or effective for her husband. Some scholars have rendered it as something closer to a longing, a desire for her husband. Now think about what that phrase does. First, it is unambiguously feminine, her husband. No male king ever carried that. Second, and this is enormous, it means that this king, this female king, was married to a man who mattered, and mattered so much that the fact of her marriage to him was built into her royal name. And the man she was married to was, on any reading of the chronology, Akhenaten. There is no other woman in 1,000 years of Egyptian kingship who carries an epithet like that. Not one. It is unique. And it was noticed, and read correctly, only in relatively recent decades, when scholars went back and looked more carefully at inscriptions that had previously been read as saying something else entirely, something like Desart of Akhenaten, and found that underneath, in the actual carving, the phrase was this feminine one instead. That single rereading is what settled it, for most specialists, that we are dealing with a woman on the throne, not a probably. A woman ruling as king at the end of the Amarna period, married to Akhenaten. That much is now, if not universally accepted, the mainstream position among the people who work on this material most closely. So notice, carefully, where that leaves us, because it is a shift that most retellings of this story get wrong. The question is no longer whether there was a female pharaoh at the end of the Amarna period. There was. That is now the mainstream position, and it rests on grammar, which is about as hard as evidence from the ancient world ever gets. The question that remains is only this: which woman was she? And that is a very different question, and a much harder one, and it is where the real fight is. Let us take up the third piece of evidence, the objects in the boy king's tomb. When Tutankhamun's tomb was found, it was crammed with things, thousands of them, the richest single archaeological find ever made in Egypt. And as scholars worked through that material over the following decades, they began to notice something peculiar about a number of the finest objects. They had been made for somebody else. Names had been recut, cartouches had been overwritten. Underneath the boy's name, in a number of cases, another name could be read, sometimes clearly, sometimes only as a ghost beneath the surface, the earlier carving not quite obliterated. And the name underneath, again and again, is the name of the female king, Ankheperur Neferneferuaten. Consider what that means. Some of the most magnificent objects buried with the most famous pharaoh in history were originally made as the funerary equipment of a woman who ruled Egypt, and were then taken back, altered, and given to the boy who came after her. There are pieces of jewelry. There are the small coffins that held the internal organs, exquisite miniature coffins of gold, and on them, beneath the boy's name, the earlier name can be detected. There is a linen shawl. There are the bands that were wrapped around the mummy itself. And there is a strong argument, made by serious scholars, that even one of the great nested coffins in which the boy's body lay was not originally made for him at all. Now, why does this matter so much? Two reasons. First, it tells us that this female king had a full royal burial prepared, with the very finest equipment that Egypt could produce. Somebody was making her a king's funeral. That is not a footnote. That is a state committing enormous resources. And second, it tells us that she died shortly before Tutankhamun, and that her burial goods were available to be reused. Which is a strange and rather chilling fact when you sit with it. Her funeral furniture was taken. Whatever happened to her, whatever burial she was given or not given, the beautiful things made for her passage into whatever came next were stripped, recut, and put in a boy's tomb instead. Let us pause here and gather the thread softly for anyone who has drifted. We have three things on the table: a household monument on which the queen's name was chiseled out, and a king's titulary carved into the gap, above a figure that is still visibly a woman, a royal throne name that is sometimes written with a feminine ending, and a royal epithet, unique in all of Egyptian history, that says, effective for her husband, and a hoard of funerary treasure in the tomb of Tutankhamun that was made for that female king, and then taken away from her. Now let us bring in the fourth piece, and it is the one that ties the knot around Nefertiti specifically. The name, Neferneferuaten. That was Nefertiti's name, not a name like hers. Hers. When the great change came and the court moved to the new city, the queen's name was extended, and the extended form was Neferneferuaten Nefertiti. It is carved that way in a great many places. For years on monuments across Egypt, Neferneferuaten was Nefertiti, and now at the end, a female king appears bearing exactly that name. Put together with everything else, the argument writes itself. A queen is raised, over years, in image after image, to the very brink of kingship. Equal scale, kingly crowns, the chariot, solitary worship, the mace over the captive. Her husband is dying. The heir is an infant. She vanishes from the record precisely when a female king appears. That female king carries her name. That female king's throne name is written with a feminine ending. That female king carries an epithet declaring her effective for her husband, and Nefertiti's husband is the king. And on a stone in a house in Amarna, Somebody took Nefertiti's name off a monument and carved a king's titulary in its place. That is the case. And when it is laid out like that, in one breath, it is very powerful, and a great many serious Egyptologists have found it compelling, and for a while, it looked very much as if the question was closing, and then the arguments against began to bite. So now let us be scrupulously fair, and build the other side, because the case against is not weak, and anyone who tells you it is has not understood it. The first objection is the simplest and the most damaging, and it is this. Nefertiti is not the only candidate, because the name Neferuaten was not carried by her alone. She had a daughter who bore the same name, Neferuaten the Younger, the fourth of her 6 girls. So the female king could be the daughter, not the mother. And there is a stronger candidate still, and her name is Meritaten, the eldest daughter. Meritaten appears, in the last years, at the king's side in the position a queen would hold. She is named as the great royal wife of that other shadowy ruler, Smenkhkare. She is manifestly a person of the highest rank in exactly the right years. And she is a king's daughter, which is a status that matters enormously in Egypt. And here is a detail that cuts. An ancient historian, writing many centuries later, working from Egyptian records that are now lost to us, appears to preserve a memory of a woman ruling in this period, and describes her as a king's daughter, not a wife. Nefertiti was not, as far as we can tell, a king's daughter. She was very probably the daughter of a courtier. If that ancient record is preserving something real, it points away from her. The second objection is the quarry inscription, and it is a serious problem for the tidy version of the story. For decades, everyone believed Nefertiti disappeared around the 12th or 14th year of her husband's reign, which left a comfortable stretch of years in which she could quietly transform into a king. And then, not long ago, someone read an inscription scratched into a rock face in a limestone quarry north of the city. It is dated to the 16th year, and it names Nefertiti alive, holding the title of Great Royal Wife. Great Royal Wife, not king, queen, and Akhenaten died in his 17th year, so the window has slammed almost shut. If Nefertiti became a king, she did it in the last months of her husband's life, or immediately after his death. There is no long, gradual elevation from queen to co-ruler across many years, because in the second to last year of the reign she was still, officially, the wife. Now, that does not kill the theory. A person can be crowned quickly, especially in an emergency, and an emergency is precisely what a king's death was. But it demolishes one popular version of the story, and it means the reign, if there was one, was very short. The third objection is the epithet itself. Read the other way. Effective for her husband. We took that as pointing to Nefertiti, because her husband was the king. But look again. If the female king is Meritaten, then her husband is Smenkhkare, who was also a king. The epithet works for her too. It does not, on its own, single out Nefertiti at all. And the fourth objection is the deepest and the most uncomfortable. And it is not about evidence, but about us. We want it to be Nefertiti. That is the honest truth, and it should make us uneasy. She is the famous one. She is the face in Berlin. A story in which the beautiful queen seizes the throne of Egypt in the collapse of everything is a magnificent story, and it sells books, and it fills documentaries. And it is exactly the shape of story that the human mind reaches for. Meritaten, the eldest daughter, ruling briefly and badly in the wreckage her parents made, is a far less satisfying tale, and it may well be the true one. And a good historian has to learn to notice the moment when the evidence is quietly being pulled toward the more beautiful answer by something other than the evidence itself. So let us gather the whole thing together now, honestly, before we move on. There was a female king of Egypt at the end of the Amarna period. That is not seriously in dispute anymore. The feminine endings and the epithet have settled it. She had a royal burial prepared, and it was taken from her and given to a boy. And she was either Nefertiti or one of Nefertiti's daughters, and the evidence, as it stands tonight, does not allow us to say which with certainty. But before we widen out, let us go back over several of these pieces much more slowly, because we moved quickly, and each of them has more inside it than we took out. Let us go back to the broken stone, the Coregency stela, and ask the question nobody can answer. Who altered it, and why? Remember what this object is. It is not a state monument. It is a private piece, from a house, the kind of thing a well-off family kept in a domestic shrine so that they could show their devotion to the royal family and, through them, to the sun disk. Somebody bought it, or commissioned it, and set it up in their home, with the king and the queen and the princess on it. And then somebody took a chisel to it, in their own house, and changed the queen into a king. Why would a private person do that? The most natural answer, and it is the one that makes the whole thing so striking, is that they were updating it. The world had changed. The names on their household shrine had gone out of date. And so they had it corrected the way you might correct a title on a document, because the woman in that picture was not the great royal wife anymore. She was the king. But notice how much that reading assumes, and notice the other possibilities. It is also possible that the alteration was not about correcting a name, but about transferring a monument, taking an old object and reassigning it to a new royal person entirely. It is possible the recarving was done not in the house at all, but later, elsewhere. And it is possible, because the stone is badly damaged and the fragments are incomplete, that the reconstruction on which everything rests is not quite right. That is the trouble. It is the most direct evidence we have, and it is a broken private object whose history of alteration we cannot fully reconstruct. If it were whole, we might have our answer. It is not whole. Petrie found it in pieces, in the rubble, more than 100 years ago, and in pieces it has remained. Let us go back now to the feminine ending, because it deserves a much closer look. The mark we are talking about is small. In the Egyptian writing system, it is a single additional sign, and its function is to say, this word refers to a woman. It is entirely ordinary. It appears in thousands of texts. What is not ordinary is finding it attached to the throne name of a pharaoh. Think about the person who carved it. A scribe, working in the royal administration, writing out the formal name of the reigning monarch. He knows the formula. He has written it 1,000 times, and he pauses, and he adds the feminine ending, because the monarch is a woman, and the language will not let him pretend otherwise. There is something very moving about that, if you slow down enough to feel it. It is a tiny act of accuracy, performed by an anonymous man 3,300 years ago, and it is the reason we know. Not the great monuments, which were smashed, not the official record, which was scrubbed. A grammatical ending, added because it was correct, and preserved because whoever came later with the hammers did not think it worth the trouble of removing. The erasers went after the big things, the temples and the statues, and the great inscribed walls. They missed the small ones. And in the end it is the small ones that survived, and it is the small ones that tell us what happened. Let us go back to the epithet, because there is more in it than we have taken out. Effect for her husband. Turn that phrase over. It is not a boast about conquest. It is not a claim of favor from any great power. It says, I am useful to my husband. I serve his interest. I am acting on his behalf. If that phrase is on the royal name of a reigning king of Egypt, then it is saying something extraordinary about how that reign was being justified. It is not saying, I rule by right. It is saying, I rule for him. And that is exactly what you would expect from a woman who has taken the throne in an emergency and needs, urgently, to explain why she is entitled to be there. She is not claiming the crown for herself. She is claiming it as an extension of her husband, as his instrument, as the person continuing his work. That is a legitimacy strategy, and it is a rather brilliant one, and it is precisely the strategy that a great royal wife with no royal blood of her own would have to use. And notice, and this is a point of real weight, that scholars who have studied the sequence of her epithets have suggested they change over time. Early on they tie her closely to her husband. Later they seem to shift, to reach past him, toward the sun disk itself and toward the language of rulership in her own right. If that reading holds and it is contested, then we can watch, in the changing epithets on a handful of surviving objects, a woman moving from ruling in a dead man's name to ruling in her own. That is one of the most extraordinary things anyone has ever claimed to be able to read out of the ancient record. And it may be true, and it may be an illusion produced by too few objects and too much hope. Let us go back to the objects in the tomb, because there is something in them we did not draw out. Somebody took her funeral away from her. Sit with that. The finest craftsmen in Egypt made her a burial. The miniature coffins for her organs, the golden fittings, the linen, the bands to wrap her body. And then, when she was dead, or perhaps before she was quite dead, those things were gathered up, and her name was cut off them, and a boy's name was cut in, and they went into his tomb instead. Now, there are innocent explanations. Royal workshops reused things, grand funerary equipment was expensive and time-consuming, and a king who died unexpectedly young needed a burial in 70 days, and there simply may not have been time to make everything fresh. Reuse happened, it is documented. But it is also possible that this was not economy. It is possible that this was punishment, that the woman who ruled at the end of the Amarna period was, when she fell, denied the burial that had been made for her, and that her equipment was stripped and reassigned as part of the same process that hacked her name out of the stone. There are scholars who have argued exactly that she was deliberately denied a royal burial, that the removal of her funerary goods was an act of erasure, not thrift. We cannot tell. But the fact sits there. The most famous grave goods in the world, the treasures of Tutankhamun that have toured the planet and been seen by millions, are in part a dead woman's stolen funeral. Now let us go back to the other figure, Smenkhkare, because we have been treating him as a footnote and he is not. The oldest view, held for a long time, was that Smenkhkare and Nefertiti were the same person, a single ruler, and that this ruler was male, and various colorful theories were built on top of that, including some fairly lurid ones about the nature of his relationship with Akhenaten, based on images of the king in intimate poses with another royal figure. That view is now largely collapsed, and it collapsed for a clean, evidential reason: the feminine endings in the epithet. Whoever Nefertiti was, she was a woman. And Smenkhkare, if the body from the mysterious tomb in the Valley of the Kings is his, was a man. So most specialists now hold that these are two separate people, a male king and a female king, ruling in the same handful of years. And that raises a question that ought to make the hair stand up on your arms. Two rulers, both using the same throne name, both operating in the same few years, both connected to the same royal daughters. What if they were not successive at all? What if they were rivals? There are scholars who have proposed exactly this, that the royal house split at the end, that a faction put forward a male king, and that a woman held the throne against him, and that for some period there were two claimants in Egypt, each using the same throne name, each insisting on their legitimacy. It would explain the strange duplication. It would explain why she was denied a proper burial. It would explain why the record is such a wreck. It is conjecture. There is no dated evidence that puts two rival kings on the throne at once, and the honest scholars who propose it say so plainly. But it is a possible reading of a very strange set of facts, and if it is true, then the last act of the Amarna period was not a sad, slow fade. It was a fight. Let us go back, before that, to a piece of evidence we have not yet touched at all. And it is a small one, and it may be the most useful of them. Somewhere in Egypt, a man wrote a note on a jar of wine. It is the kind of label that estates put on their produce: the year, the vintage, the estate, the person under whose authority it was made. Utterly ordinary. Nobody was making a statement. Somebody was doing paperwork. And that label carries a regnal year, which means it was written in a year that was counted as belonging to a reign. Why does that matter? Because a regnal year is not a courtesy, it is an administrative fact. It means the bureaucracy of Egypt, the scribes and the estates and the granaries and the tax collectors, the machinery that actually ran the country, was counting the years of that reign as a reign, not a regency, not an interim. A reign with a first year and a second year recorded on wine jars by men who had no interest in propaganda and were simply doing their jobs. There is a similar trace elsewhere, an inscription left by a visitor in a tomb, dated by the regnal year of this ruler, mentioning ordinary matters, small things, wine labels and graffiti. And they tell us something that no monument could, because monuments lie and paperwork does not bother to. They tell us that this female king was not a shadow, not a title on a stela, not a theological gesture. She was the ruler of record. The clerks were counting her years. And there is a hint in the number of those years, too. The dated material suggests a reign that was short, perhaps 2 years or something in that range, though scholars argue over the reading. Not a long reign, not a stable one. 2 or 3 years, at the end of everything, with the country coming apart around her. Let us go back now to the images, because we listed them quickly at the start, and they deserve to be looked at one at a time, slowly, as evidence rather than as decoration. Take the equal scale first. In Egyptian art, size is not perspective, size is rank. A king is large because he is a king. His officials are small because they are officials. The enemies under his feet are smaller still. This is not a style choice. It is a grammar, and every Egyptian who could see could read it. And in the art of Amarna, Nefertiti is repeatedly the same size as her husband. Not slightly smaller, as queens were, the same. Which means that whoever was directing that art was making, over and over, in the most legible visual language available, the statement that this woman stood at the king's own level. Take the crowns next. Egyptian headgear was a code, and every crown said something specific, and Nefertiti wears things no queen had worn. She wears the tall, flat-topped blue crown that appears nowhere else in Egyptian art on anyone ever. She wears in some images the emblem of royal authority at her brow. In one relief she is shown in a hairstyle associated with soldiers. Each of these is a borrowing from the wardrobe of kingship, and each one, on its own, might be dismissed as a flourish. Together they are a pattern, and patterns are what historians look for. Take the chariot. A queen driving her own chariot, reins in her hands, is an image of command and motion and mastery, and it is not the imagery of consorts, it is the imagery of rulers. Take the solitary worship. In the theology of Amarna, the rituals were the king's to perform. That was the entire point of the arrangement, that access to the light ran through the royal person. And Nefertiti shone performing them alone, without her husband in the scene. Somebody decided that she could do that. Somebody decided the ritual worked when she did it by herself. And take the mace. The scene of the king standing over a bound captive, arm raised, weapon lifted, is the single oldest image in the entire Egyptian visual tradition. It goes back thousands of years to the very first kings, to the very beginning of the Egyptian state. It says this person holds back chaos. It is not shared. It is not lent out. It belongs to the pharaoh. And on a block from Amarna, the figure raising the mace in the tall crown is a woman. Now here is the argument that this makes possible, and it is the strongest form of the case for Nefertiti, and it deserves to be stated at its full strength. None of those images, taken alone, proves anything. But look at them as a sequence, across years, and a shape emerges. Somebody was preparing Egypt to accept something. You do not, in a deeply traditional society, simply announce one morning that a woman is now king. You prepare the ground, you accustom the eye, you show her at the king's scale, and then in the king's crowns, and then in the king's chariot, and then performing the king's rituals, and then at last in the king's most sacred pose, with the mace in her hand. And by the time you crown her, the population has been looking at a woman doing kingly things for 15 years, and it is no longer unthinkable. That is what the images look like, if you read them as a campaign. And the co-regency, the crowning, becomes not a shocking innovation but the last step in a long, patient, deliberate process that had been running in public, in stone, for most of her reign. It is a genuinely beautiful argument, and I want to be honest and say that it may be entirely wrong, because there is another reading of exactly the same images, and it is not a foolish one. That reading says, this is theology, not politics. In the belief system of Amarna, the arrangement was a triad, 3 parts, the sun disk and the king and the queen. The disk gave life to the royal couple. The royal couple gave life to Egypt. On that model, Nefertiti had to be shown as the king's equal, because in the theology she was his counterpart, the female half of a matched pair through whom the light passed into the world. Her kingly imagery would then be a statement about her place in the sacred structure, not a rehearsal for a throne. And on that reading, the mace scene is not a political announcement at all. It is a theological one. She holds back chaos because that is her half of the work. So which is it? Preparation for kingship or a statement of theology? The images cannot tell us. They show us what was done. They are silent about why. And it gets stranger, because both readings could be true at once. Theology in Egypt was never separate from politics. It was the language in which politics was conducted. A theological elevation of the queen would be, in practice, a political elevation of the queen, and nobody at the time would have needed to distinguish them. We are asking a question that the people who made these images may not have recognized as a question at all. Let us pause here for one more thing before we gather up, and it is the human question underneath all of this, and it is the one nobody can answer and everyone thinks about. Did she want it? We have been talking about the evidence as though it were a legal case, and rightly so. But there was a person here, a woman in perhaps her middle 30s, 3 or 4 of her 6 daughters dead, one of them buried with a scene of her own grief carved on the wall above the body, her husband dying or dead, her city built on a belief that half the country loathed, an empire writing letters nobody answers, priests in the old temples counting the days, and a crown on a table in an empty room. Did she reach for it? Did she take it because she wanted power? Or because there was nobody else in the building who could hold it? Or because her husband asked her to with his last strength? Or because a faction in the court put it in her hands and told her to sit down and be quiet and sign what she was given? The stone does not say, it never says. It shows us a woman with a king's name and a king's titles and a grammatical ending that gives her away, and it tells us absolutely nothing about what she felt when she put the crown on. And that, in the end, is the thing about Nefertiti that never resolves. We have her face, in a glass case in Berlin, looked at by millions. We may, if the reading holds, have her throne. And we do not have, and we will never have, one single word of her voice. And now let us pause once more, gently, and gather all of it together. Because we have covered a great deal of ground and a listener may have drifted. There was a female king of Egypt at the end of the Amarna period. The feminine endings on the throne name prove it. The unique epithet, effective for her husband, proves it. She had a full royal burial prepared with the finest goods Egypt could make, and those goods were taken from her and given to the boy Tutankhamun. A private household monument in Amarna had the queen's name chiseled out and this king's titulary carved into the gap, above a figure that is still visibly a woman. And her royal name, Nefertiti, was Nefertiti's own name. Against that, Nefertiti was still called Great Royal Wife in the 16th year, leaving almost no room for a reign. An ancient source seems to describe the female ruler as a king's daughter, which Nefertiti was not. Two of Nefertiti's daughters are viable candidates, and one of them, Nefertiti, is a strong one. And the epithet about a husband works just as well for a daughter married to a king as it does for Nefertiti. That is where the evidence sits tonight. Both cases are real. Both are argued by people who have spent their working lives inside this material. Neither is decisive, and neither can be dismissed, and the honest scholar of this period lives with that discomfort rather than resolving it prematurely. That is the honest position. Now let us widen out and look at the years around her and at what a reign like that would actually have meant. So we have the evidence on the table, and we have both cases, and neither one closes. Let us widen the view now, because a question like this cannot be answered by staring harder at the same fragments. It has to be set inside the world it came from. So let us look at the years around her, and the people in the room, and the machinery of a kingdom coming apart, and see whether the wider story makes one reading more likely than the other. Let us begin with the boy, because everything in these years bends around him. Tutankhamun was born, most likely, in the later years of Akhenaten's reign. He was almost certainly not Nefertiti's son. The evidence points to another woman of the royal household as his mother. And that fact is the hinge on which this whole story turns. So let us be very clear about what it means. If Nefertiti had borne a son, none of this would have happened. There would have been no crisis, no ambiguity, no female king. The boy would have been raised as heir, and when his father died, he would have taken the throne, and his mother would have been queen mother, an honorable and well-understood position with no need for chisels or feminine grammatical endings. The whole question we are asking tonight exists only because of an absence, the absence of a son from the great royal wife. Instead, there was a boy who was somebody else's, and he was tiny. When Akhenaten died, this child was perhaps 6 or 7 years old. A child of 6 cannot perform the rituals that hold the world in place. A child of 6 cannot command an army, or answer a letter from a vassal king, or face down a priesthood that has been waiting 17 years for its revenge. Somebody had to stand in front of that child. Somebody had to fill the space between a 6-year-old boy and a kingdom that was, in the most literal sense the Egyptians understood, coming apart at the seams. And in Egypt, when a king was too young, there was a well-worn answer to this. A woman stood in front of him. The king's mother, or a senior royal woman, acted as regent. This was not scandalous, it was normal. It had been done many times, and it is very likely that some arrangement of this kind is what we are looking at, in part, at the end of the Amarna period. But here is where it gets interesting, and where the Hatshepsut precedent comes back like a bell, because we know that in Egypt, the line between regent and king was not a wall, it was a door, and it had been walked through before. So picture the sequence. The king dies. There is a boy who cannot rule. A senior royal woman steps forward to hold the throne. And then, at some point, whether after a month or after a year, the arrangement hardens, and the woman who was holding the seat is sitting in it, and the scribes are writing her throne name with a feminine ending on wine jar labels, and the estates are counting the years of her reign. That is not a coup. Nobody storms a palace. That is drift, the slow hardening of a temporary arrangement into a permanent one, of a kind that has happened in every emergency government that has ever existed anywhere. And it may be exactly what happened here, quietly, over a few months, in a city in the desert, while the men with the granaries watched and waited and said nothing. Now let us bring in the other man in the room, the one who is always at the edge of the frame, and who may be the most important person in this entire story. I was a courtier of the highest rank. He was there at the beginning. He was very probably Nefertiti's father, though no text quite says it. His wife had been the nurse who raised Nefertiti. He held titles that put him physically close to the king, which in a court is the only kind of power that finally matters. And he survived everything. He survived the heresy. He survived the collapse. He served the boy king through his short reign. And when that boy died childless at around 19, I did not step aside. He took the throne of Egypt himself, an old man, and ruled as pharaoh. Now sit with what that means for our question. If Nefertiti took the crown at the death of her husband, then her father, or the man who was very probably her father, was standing beside her when she did it. And a woman with no royal blood does not simply pick up the crown of Egypt on her own. She needs a faction. She needs men with soldiers, and men with granaries, and men with the ear of the court. And here is a man who had spent 40 years accumulating exactly that, and who would, in the end, take the throne himself. We cannot prove he put her there, but it is very hard to imagine it happening without him, and it is worth noticing, coldly, that whoever ruled in those years, ended up with the crown eventually. Every road in this period runs through that old man, and yet we cannot see a single decision he made, a single word he said, a single move he took. He is everywhere, and he is invisible, and that combination, in a court, is usually the signature of the person who is actually winning. Now let us bring in the priesthoods, because they are the invisible pressure on every page of this story. Understand what Akhenaten had done to them. He had not merely introduced a new belief. He had closed the ancient temples and cut off their revenues. The great temple of the figure they revered as Amun at Karnak was not just a house of worship. It was one of the largest landholders and employers in the world, with estates and granaries and thousands of people whose lives ran through it. And he shut it. 17 years of that. And then the man who did it dies, and what is left is a female ruler with no royal blood, or a young royal daughter, holding a throne on behalf of a small boy, in a city in the desert that produces nothing and imports everything, defending a belief that the entire priestly and landed establishment of Egypt regards as a catastrophe. That is not a position anyone could hold. And she did not hold it, because look at what happens next, and look at how fast it happens. Within a few years of Akhenaten's death, the boy's name is changed. The sun disk is stripped out of it, and the old name is put back. The court leaves Amarna. The old temples reopen. A great inscription is set up in the boy's name describing the land as they had found it. The sanctuaries fallen, the shrines overgrown, the sacred places abandoned, the country in disorder, and announcing that all of it is now being put right. That is not a policy adjustment. That is not a compromise or a softening. That is a total and unconditional capitulation, an admission that the entire 17-year experiment had been a disaster. And it happened while the king of Egypt was a child of 9 or 10, which means that it was done by the men around him. The restoration was not the boy's decision. It was the decision of the adults, and the adults included I. Now, here is why that matters for the female king. Whatever she was on the losing side of that. She ruled in the name of a dead heretic. She was the last defender of a belief that was about to be destroyed by the people standing next to her. And when the restoration came, she was in the way. And people who are in the way, in that court, in that particular decade, get erased. We have watched it happen already, more than once, in this very story. Kia, another woman of Akhenaten's household, was chiseled off her own monuments. Her images were cut, her name overwritten. It was a technique they had. It was by this point almost a habit. So if you ask why the evidence for this female pharaoh is so damaged and so scarce, the answer is standing right there. She was on the wrong side of the biggest reversal in Egyptian history, and the winners had chisels, and they were not sentimental. Let us bring in one more figure, and then we will draw this together. Horemheb. Horemheb was a general, a man of the army, and after I's death he took the throne, and he set out to finish the job. Not merely to restore the old belief, which was already done, but to remove the entire episode from history. The temples of the sun disk were pulled down and their blocks buried as fill inside other buildings. The names of everyone involved were struck out, and in the official king lists compiled afterward, the whole period is simply gone. The succession runs from Akhenaten's father straight through to the restoration, as though the intervening reigns never occurred. Not condemned, not explained, deleted. And when a later scribe had occasion to refer to that king at all, in the centuries that followed, he did not use his name. He would not write it. He wrote, instead, simply, the enemy, as though the name itself had become something too dangerous to set down on papyrus. That is the world our question sits in. It is a world in which the historical record was deliberately mutilated by a state with every resource at its disposal and every motive to do it thoroughly. And so when we ask why we cannot simply look up whether Nefertiti became a king, the answer is, because someone made sure we could not. And let us note, before we draw it together, one small and rather chilling detail about the erasure, because it tells us what kind of people we are dealing with. They did not simply hack out the names of the living enemies. They went after the dead. They pulled down buildings that were already standing and broke them up for fill. They went into tombs, and in the case of at least one royal burial of this period, somebody entered the tomb, defaced the coffin, cut the name out of the gold, and destroyed the face on the mask, and then left the body lying there, nameless, so that in Egyptian belief it could not be recognized and could not pass into whatever came next. That is not politics. That is an attempt to kill someone after they are already dead. And that is the treatment that was being handed out in those years to people on the wrong side of the Restoration. So when we ask what happened to a female king who ruled in the name of the heresy, and why we cannot find her, we should keep that in mind. It is entirely possible that we cannot find her, because somebody made very sure that she would never be found. Now let us draw this white story together and see what it does to our question. It tells us, first, that the conditions for a female king were not merely present at the end of the Amarna period. They were overwhelming. A dead king, an infant heir who was not the queen's son, a collapsing religion, a hostile establishment, a capital city that could not feed itself, an empire in trouble. If ever there was a moment in Egyptian history when a senior royal woman would have had to pick up a crown, this was it. It tells us, second, that whoever picked it up was doomed. The Restoration was coming, and it was going to sweep away everything, and there was no version of this in which the last defender of the sun disk kept her throne and her name and her tomb. And it tells us, third, why the evidence looks exactly the way it looks. Fragmentary, altered, hacked, reused, contradictory, and thin. That is not a puzzle to be explained. That is the fingerprint of a deliberate erasure, and it is precisely what we should expect to find. None of which proves that the woman was Nefertiti. Meritaten fits into that story too. But it does tell us that the story itself, a female king at the end of Amarna, ruling briefly and then being annihilated from the record, is not an exotic hypothesis. It is very close to being the only thing that makes any sense at all of the wreckage we actually find in the ground. But we have moved quickly again, so let us go back and dwell more slowly on several of these threads, because each of them has more inside it, and the night is long, and there is no hurry at all. Let us go back, first, to the city itself, because the place where all this happened was itself part of the problem, and we have not said enough about that. Amarna could not feed itself. That sounds like a small point, and it is not. It may be the most important practical fact about the entire Amarna period. The city was built in a bay of desert with almost no agricultural land worth speaking of. Everything had to be brought in. The grain, the goods, the labor, all shipped down the river from elsewhere in Egypt and hauled up from the quay. It existed only because the state chose to keep it existing. Now think about what that means for a ruler trying to hold power there after the king who built it is dead. Your capital is an artificial construction in the middle of nowhere, sustained entirely by the willingness of the rest of Egypt to keep sending food to it. Every granary that stops sending, every estate manager who decides the wind has changed, is a knife at your throat. You are not governing from a fortress. You are governing from a place that dies the moment people stop humoring you. And the people who controlled the estates and the granaries were, in very large part, the same people whose temples had been shut. So the physical position of the female king, whoever she was appallingly weak. She sat in a city that could be starved by inaction, defending a belief that the men with the grain despised, with an infant heir who was somebody else's son, and an army commanded by ambitious men who owed her nothing. That she lasted 2 or 3 years at all in a position like that is, when you look at it squarely, faintly astonishing, and it suggests a person of considerable skill and considerable nerve. And it explains, better than anything else, why the reign ended and why the court went back to the old cities the moment it could. It was not merely a religious reversal. It was a return to places that worked. Let us go back to the boy, and to the desperate letter, because it is the most human document to come out of this entire period, and it tells us more about the world our female king was living in than any monument. When Tutankhamun died, at around 19, he left no living heir. 2 tiny mummified infants were placed in his tomb with him, daughters who never drew breath, and his widow, Ankhesenamun, who was Nefertiti's 3rd daughter, was left alone at the top of a kingdom with nobody to hold it. And a letter survives, preserved not in Egypt but in the archives of a foreign kingdom far to the north, written by an Egyptian queen of about this period to a foreign king. And what it says in effect is this: "My husband is dead, and I have no son, and I am afraid, and I do not want to marry one of my servants. Send me one of your sons, and I will make him king of Egypt." Read that again slowly. An Egyptian queen writing to a foreign power, asking for a husband, because she cannot face what is waiting for her at home. That is not a diplomatic maneuver. That is a woman in a trap. The foreign king could scarcely believe it, and sent an envoy to check whether it was a trick. She wrote again, sharply, insisting, and so a prince was sent, and he was killed somewhere on the road, before he ever reached Egypt, and then I took the throne. And Ankhesenamun disappears from the record entirely. Now hold that letter beside our question, because it is enormously illuminating. It tells us what a royal woman's position actually was in that court, in that decade, when the men had the soldiers and the granaries and she had only a title. It tells us that being a queen of Egypt at that moment was to be terrifyingly exposed. And it tells us, chillingly, what happened to a royal woman who tried to act independently. Her plan was destroyed, and she vanished. If that could happen to Ankhesenamun, then imagine the position of a woman who had actually taken the crown a few years earlier. She would have been the single most exposed person in the whole of Egypt, holding a crown that half the kingdom wanted taken off her head. Let us go back to I, because we have not finished with him, and he will not go away. There is a painted scene on the wall of the burial chamber of Tutankhamun. It shows the boy's mummy, upright, and a figure standing before it in the dress and regalia of a king, performing the rite that opened the mouth of the dead so that they might eat and speak in whatever came next. This was traditionally performed by the heir, the successor, the one taking up what the dead man had put down. The figure is named. It is A. So the old courtier had himself painted as king in the tomb of the boy he had served, performing the last rite over his body. That is not the act of a passive administrator. That is a man planting a flag, and it is worth asking in the quiet, what did I want through all those years? He served the heretic, he served the Restoration, he served a boy, and at the end he took the crown himself, an old man with perhaps 4 years of life left in him. What was he doing for the 40 years before that? We cannot see. That is the maddening thing. The one man who was present at every turning point of this entire story, who was very probably the father of our central figure, who outlived them all and took the throne, is essentially invisible to us. He left monuments, but they tell us nothing about his choices. He is a shape at the edge of every scene, and the shape never speaks. And when I died, the general Horemheb took the throne, and Horemheb erased I too. His monuments were attacked, his name was struck. The great survivor did not survive after all. Let us go back now to a question we have not asked directly, and it is a practical one. What would a woman actually have to do to become king of Egypt? She would need, first, the priesthood, or what was left of it. Coronation was a ritual act. Somebody has to put the crowns on. Somebody has to perform the rites that transform a person into a king. She would need, second, the army, or at least its acquiescence. Egypt's military was commanded by men, and in these very years one of those men, Horemheb, was rising fast. If the army had said no, there would have been no rain. She would need, third, the administration. The scribes, the treasurers, the estate managers, the men who counted the grain. And here, remarkably, we can see that she had it because of those wine jar labels. The bureaucracy was counting her regnal years. The clerks were on board, and she would need, fourth, a story, a reason. And this is where that extraordinary epithet comes back into focus. Effect for her husband, that is the story. That is the justification. I am not seizing anything. I am continuing my husband's work. I am his instrument. The throne is his. I am merely keeping it warm and doing what he would have done. That is exactly the kind of claim a woman without royal blood would have to make, and it is exactly the claim she made, and it is carved into her royal name. And notice, and this is the thing that gives the theory its real force, that if you were designing a legitimacy strategy for Nefertiti specifically, that is the one you would design. She had no royal blood to appeal to. All she had was her marriage, and 17 years of standing beside the king in the imagery of the state, and a name that had been bound to the sun disk since the day the new belief was proclaimed. So you build the claim on the husband, because the husband is all she has. Meriteten, by contrast, had royal blood. She was a king's daughter. She would not have needed to lean so heavily on a husband, and an ancient source, as we saw, appears to describe the female ruler precisely as a king's daughter. And so the two candidates pull in opposite directions on the very same piece of evidence, and this is the frustration of the whole field in miniature. Every fragment, examined closely enough, seems to point both ways at once. Let us go back as well to the empire, because it is the pressure from outside, and it was real. The clay tablets found at Amarna are the diplomatic correspondence of the Egyptian court, and among them are letters from Egypt's own vassal rulers in the lands to the north. And those letters are, many of them, pleas. Enemies are pressing. Cities have fallen. Neighbors have turned. Send troops. Send archers. Why does the king not answer? Now, we must be careful, because vassal rulers always exaggerated, and every man asking for soldiers says the situation is desperate. But the tone is unmistakable, and it runs through the whole archive. The sense of an imperial power whose attention has drifted, of a house where the people upstairs have stopped coming down. And now set that beside our female king. Whoever she was, she inherited that. She inherited a frontier that was fraying and an empire that was writing letters nobody had been answering, and she inherited it with no military reputation, no royal blood in some readings, and a court full of men who had their own ideas. There is no evidence that she campaigned. There is no evidence that she did anything about the North at all. And there may be a very simple reason for that, which is that she had nothing to campaign with. And every soldier in Egypt was commanded by men who were already looking past her toward whatever came next. That too is part of the wider story. Not everything is theology and grammar. Somewhere out on the northern roads, cities were falling, and the woman on the throne of Egypt could do nothing about it, and everybody knew. Let us go back, last, to the shape of the ending, because it is worth seeing whole. Whoever she was, her reign was short. The dated material suggests perhaps 2 years, maybe 3, and then it stops. And what followed was not a peaceful transition. It was a repudiation. The boy's name was changed, the court left the desert city, the temples reopened, and a great proclamation was made announcing that the land had been in ruin and was now being set right. Every element of the world she had ruled was dismantled, deliberately, within a very few years of her death, and her funeral was taken from her and given to the boy. That is not the treatment of a respected predecessor. That is the treatment of an embarrassment. And whether the woman in question was Nefertiti or her daughter, the people who came after wanted the memory of a female pharaoh, ruling in the name of discredited belief, gone, not softened, gone. They very nearly managed it. What survived, survived by accident. A chisel mark on a private stone in somebody's house, a grammatical ending on a wine label, a ghost of a name under a boy's cartouche on a coffin. That is all she left. And out of those scraps, 3,300 years later, we are attempting to reconstruct a reign. And there is one more thing to say before we go to the stones, and it is perhaps the most important thing in this entire section. And it is about what all of this does to our question. Notice that the wider story does not tell us which woman it was. It cannot. Nefertiti fits into that collapsing world just as well as her mother does. But notice what the wider story does do, which is far more useful. It removes the strangeness. When you first hear the claim, it sounds outlandish. The beautiful queen from the museum became a pharaoh. It sounds like the kind of thing invented for a documentary. And then you look at the actual situation, and the outlandishness drains away, and what is left is something closer to inevitability. The king is dead. The heir is 6 years old and is not the queen's son. The capital cannot feed itself. The empire is in trouble. Half the country wants the whole thing torn down. The rituals that, in Egyptian belief, hold the world together have to be performed by somebody every single day, or the sky falls. Somebody had to pick up the crown. There was no version of these events in which nobody picked it up. And in that room in that year, there was one adult who had been standing beside the king for 17 years, who had been shown at his scale, in his crowns, in his chariot, performing his rituals, raising his mace. Whether that person was Nefertiti or Meritati, the shape of what happened is the same, and the shape is not exotic. It is what a state does when the roof comes off. That is what the wider story gives us, not an answer. Something better. It makes the question sane. Now let us turn to the evidence itself once more, but this time to the hard physical stuff. The tombs, the bodies, the scans, and the hunt that is still going on. So let us come to the physical evidence, the things that can be measured and scanned and tested. Because if Nefertiti became a king, then she was buried as a king, and a king's burial is a very large object, and large objects tend to leave traces. And here we run straight into the deepest strangeness of this whole story. We have never found her. Let us start with what a king's burial would have meant, so that we understand the size of the hole in our knowledge. A pharaoh of the 18th dynasty was buried in the Valley of the Kings in a rock-cut tomb with nested coffins, a stone sarcophagus, chambers full of equipment, and the whole apparatus of a royal funeral. These are not small or subtle installations. They are enormous and expensive, and they took years to prepare. Now the funerary equipment made for our female king turns up in Tutankhamun's tomb, recut and reassigned, so the equipment existed. Somebody was preparing her burial as a king. But the burial itself, the tomb, the body, is nowhere. We do not have it. The numbers are striking when you set them out plainly. Of the 6 daughters of Nefertiti, not one body has ever been identified with certainty. Of Nefertiti herself, no body, no coffin, no tomb, nothing but a few fragments of small funerary figurines carrying her name. Of the female king Nefertiti, no burial at all, only her stolen grave goods in somebody else's tomb. An entire royal family, the most powerful family on earth, and we cannot produce a single securely identified body among the women of it. That is not normal. It is not even close to normal. Egypt kept its dead more carefully and more successfully than any civilization in the history of the world. And this family, the most powerful family on earth in its day, has simply vanished out of the ground. So people have looked, and they have looked hard, and let us go through what they found. The first great hunt centered on a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, found at the very end of the 19th century by a French archaeologist named Victor Larrey. It had been made originally for an earlier king, and had later been used as a hiding place where priests of a later age stashed royal bodies to protect them from robbers. And in a side chamber lay 3 unwrapped bodies, an older woman, a younger woman, and a boy. The younger woman became known simply as the younger lady, and for a time there was real hope. Here was an unidentified royal woman of roughly the right period. In the early years of this century, a British Egyptologist argued the case publicly and forcefully. The double-pierced ear, the shaven head, the mark on the brow where a tight royal band had pressed. It was announced on television. It caused an enormous row, scholarly and political, and the researcher was for a time barred from working in Egypt. And then genetic testing was done, and it took the whole thing apart. The testing indicated that the younger lady was the mother of Tutankhamun, and that she was herself the daughter of the great king Amenhotep III and his queen Tai, which is to say a sister of Akhenaten. Nefertiti, on all the evidence we have, was not a royal princess and was not that king's daughter. So the younger lady, if the testing holds, is not Nefertiti. That work has been challenged. Ancient genetic material degrades. Contamination is a real hazard. The samples are few. Serious specialists have raised serious objections. But the mainstream position today is that the younger lady is somebody else, and the search moved on. And where it moved to was the most famous tomb in the world. Some years ago, an English Egyptologist named Nicholas Reeves was studying very high-resolution laser scans of the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb. And in the faint topography beneath the painted plaster, he thought he could see straight lines, the ghosts of edges, the outlines, he proposed, of doorways that had been blocked, plastered, and painted over. And from that, he built a theory that went round the world. The boy's tomb, he pointed out, is strange. It is very small for a king. Its layout is odd, and it turns in a direction more typical of the burial of a royal woman than of a king. The decoration looks rushed, and a great many of the objects inside it were not made for him at all, but recut from the equipment of that female ruler, Nefertiti. So what if, he asked, the tomb was never his? What if it was cut for someone who died shortly before him? A ruler whose funeral goods we can see being cannibalized all around us, and the boy, dying unexpectedly at 19, was hurried into the outer rooms of an existing tomb because there was nowhere else to put him. And what if that earlier occupant is still there, sealed behind the painted north wall? What if Nefertiti had been lying a few feet away, on the other side of a wall, while millions of tourists filed past? It is one of the great modern archaeological hypotheses, and its beauty is that, unlike most speculation about the ancient world, it could actually be tested. And so they tested it. They brought in ground-penetrating radar, and the results have been a mess. The first survey seemed to show something: voids, anomalies, spaces behind the walls. There was enormous excitement. Then a second survey, by a different team with different equipment, found nothing. Then a third, and the readings have gone back and forth ever since, survey after survey, team after team, some suggesting a corridor-like space somewhere in the vicinity, others flatly contradicting them. At the time of this telling, no hidden chamber behind the wall of that tomb has been demonstrated. The mainstream view has cooled considerably. The theory is not confirmed. It is also, in fairness, not conclusively dead. It sits there, unresolved, refusing either to be confirmed or to be finally killed. That is an uncomfortable place for a story to sit, and we would all much prefer an answer, and it is nevertheless exactly and precisely where the evidence actually is tonight. And this brings us to something that has to be said plainly, in the calm of the night. Nefertiti attracts announcements. Her tomb has been found in the newspapers more than once. Bodies have been identified as hers and then unidentified. There is a rhythm to it, a cycle of headline and quiet retraction that has been running for decades. And it happens because her name sells, and because certainty sells better than doubt, and because there is always someone willing to supply it. The responsible position held by most serious Egyptologists is simply this: we do not know where Nefertiti is buried. We have never found her body. We have never found her tomb. And every claim to the contrary has so far failed to hold up. Now let us deal briefly and firmly with the fringe. The Amarna period attracts a great deal of nonsense because it is strange and because the record is broken, and broken records are exactly where people love to insert their own inventions. So you will find claims that this family were not human, that the elongated skulls in the art are evidence of another species, that the whole episode was contact with something from beyond the world. Let us be clear, there is no evidence for any of it. The distinctive body shapes in Amarna art appear on everyone in the royal circle, including people we have no reason to think were physically unusual, which points to an artistic style rather than a record of anatomy. And the one body of this family we can examine, the boy king, is anatomically an ordinary human being. This is not science fiction. This is a real woman in a real palace at a real moment of collapse with a real crown on a table in front of her. And the true story is far more interesting than any of the invented ones, because the true story is that a human being, a woman with a name and a face and dead children, had to make a decision under impossible pressure in a burning house with no good options at all, and we can very nearly see her doing it. We can almost make her out. And then the record breaks off in our hands. And let us end this section on the hopeful note, because there is one, and it is real. The quarry inscription, the one that put Nefertiti alive in the 16th year and rewrote the whole chronology, was found only a few years ago. Not by a great expedition. Somebody was looking carefully at a rock face in an old limestone quarry that people had walked past for a century, and read what was scratched there, and understood what it meant. That is how this knowledge moves. Slowly, and then all at once, and it moves because things survive that nobody expected to survive, in places nobody thought to look. Egypt is not finished. Only a fraction of it has been excavated. Amarna is still yielding after more than a century of digging. The Valley of the Kings, which everyone assumed had been exhausted, produced a new tomb in living memory. Somewhere out there, under the sand or a village or a field, there may be a chamber with a coffin in it, and a name on that coffin, written in 2 cartouches, with a small feminine ending on the throne name. Nobody can promise that. Nobody honest would. But nobody can rule it out either, and that is not nothing. And that is why, every season, year after year, they go back out into the heat with their brushes and their sieves and their sifting trays and start digging again. Because Egypt has surprised them before, more than once, and it will surprise them again. First, though, let us look properly at the site where nearly all of this material came from, because Amarna is one of the most remarkable archaeological places on Earth, and it explains why we have anything at all. Almost every other great Egyptian city was lived in continuously for thousands of years. People built on the old buildings, and then on those, and the ancient layers were cut through and robbed and buried under later towns that are often still there today. That is why so much of ancient Egypt is simply unreachable. It is under a modern street. Amarna was different. It was occupied for a single generation, and then abandoned, and nobody ever came back. There was no reason to. It was the capital of a discredited belief, in a place with no farmland and no strategic value. And so it sat there, in its bay of desert, essentially undisturbed except by robbers and wind, for 3,300 years, which means Amarna is a snapshot. A single decade of Egyptian life, laid out flat, with its palaces and temples and workshops and houses and rubbish heaps and cemeteries all belonging to the same brief span. There is nowhere else like it in Egypt, and it is why the evidence for our question exists at all. The Cregency stela came out of a house there. The clay letters came out of a rubbish heap there. The wine jar labels came from the estates that served it. The whole fragile scaffolding of what we know about a possible female pharaoh rests on things that survived because a city was abandoned rather than rebuilt. The erasure destroyed the monuments. The abandonment saved the paperwork, and in the end it is the paperwork that tells us what happened, because the monuments were lying anyway. But let us go back over several of these things more slowly, because we have rushed them, and each one holds more than we took out. Let us go back to the tomb of Tutankhamun and look at it properly as evidence, because the argument about it is more careful than the headlines suggested. Start with the size. Royal tombs in that valley were substantial, long corridors, multiple chambers, staircases, pillared halls. Tutankhamun's is tiny, 4 small rooms and only one of them decorated. For the burial of a king of the 18th dynasty, at the height of Egyptian wealth, it is absurdly modest. Now, the usual explanation is straightforward, and it is probably right. He died suddenly and young, no tomb had been prepared for him, and they had 70 days, which was the time the embalming took, to find him somewhere to go. So they used what was available. That is not controversial, but available from where? That is the question Reeves was asking. And he noticed something suggestive. The tomb's layout turns to the right, and in that valley, tombs that turn to the right tend to be associated with the burials of royal women. Kings' tombs tended to turn the other way. It is a tendency, not a law, and other scholars have pushed back on how strong the pattern really is. But it is there. And then there are the objects. Not one or two, but a whole class of them. The finest pieces in that tomb, recut, jewelry. The miniature coffins for the organs, exquisite things of gold and colored glass, with the earlier name detectable beneath the boys. The bands wrapped round the mummy, a linen shawl, and, most striking of all, an argument that one of the great nested coffins in which the boy lay was not made for him either, and that the face on it is not quite his face. Put those together and you get a hypothesis rather than a fantasy. This was somebody else's burial, and the boy was pushed into it. And if that is right, then the person it belonged to is one of a very small number of candidates, and the leading one is the female king whose name keeps appearing under his. Now, what the radar has done to this is genuinely murky, and I want to be fair to everybody. The first surveys were interpreted as showing voids behind the north and west walls. That was announced with great confidence, and Egyptology went briefly mad. A second independent survey found nothing. A third, conducted by a different team again, was inconclusive. More recent work has been read by some as showing a corridor-like space in the general region, but possibly unconnected to the tomb, and possibly a natural feature. Radar through limestone is not a simple business. The rock is not uniform. There are cracks and fills and voids that are simply geology. Different equipment, different frequencies, different processing, and you get different pictures. The technology is not lying, but it is not speaking clearly either. So where does it leave us? Unresolved. Genuinely, honestly unresolved. The hypothesis is elegant, it is testable in principle, and the tests have not settled it. That is an uncomfortable answer, and it is the true one. Let us go back, now, to the bodies, because there is more to say about how badly this whole family's remains have been treated. Royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings were robbed extensively in antiquity, and in a later age, priests gathered up what remained of the royal dead, rewrapped them, moved them, hid them in caches to protect them. In the process, bodies were separated from their coffins, coffins were reused, labels were lost, and identities became hopelessly confused. The mummies we have from this period have been unwrapped, moved, rewrapped, and moved again across 3,000 years. And then there is the body from the strange tomb known as 55, which is one of the most disturbing archaeological finds in the valley. A small, hastily arranged burial. A coffin whose face had been ripped off and whose name had been cut out. Funerary goods belonging to several different people, jumbled together, and a male body inside. Many scholars believe that body is Akhenaten himself. Others have argued for Smenkhkare. The genetic testing has been read as supporting the identification of that body as the father of Tutankhamun, which would point to Akhenaten. It is contested, like everything here. But notice the state of it. Whoever he was, somebody went into that tomb and destroyed his name and his face, deliberately, so that he could not be identified and, in Egyptian belief, could not be sustained in the next world. That was done on purpose by people who knew exactly what they were doing. And that is the context in which we go looking for a female king who ruled in the name of the same heresy. If they did that to him, what did they do to her? Let us go back, finally, to the genetic evidence, and be honest about its limits, because it has been used far too confidently in popular accounts. The testing of these royal mummies gave a family tree, and that tree has consequences. It makes Nefertiti almost certainly not the mother of Tutankhamun, and it makes the younger lady almost certainly not Nefertiti. Those results have shaped the field, but serious specialists have raised serious objections. Ancient genetic material degrades badly, especially in Egyptian conditions. Contamination from modern handling is a permanent hazard, and these bodies have been handled a great deal. The number of samples is small, and the interpretation of the results depends on assumptions about who is related to whom that are, in some cases, precisely what is being tested. So the mainstream accepts the broad picture. A minority does not. and it would be dishonest to present the family tree of the Amarna royal house as settled science, when the people who work on it hardest do not treat it that way. And let us be clear, as well, about one methodological point that governs everything in this section, because it is where most popular accounts go wrong. We are not going to settle this question with a body. Suppose tomorrow, someone finds a royal mummy of a woman of the right period. What would that actually prove? It would prove that a royal woman was buried there. It would not, on its own, tell us her name, because names were cut out and coffins were reused and labels were lost. We would need an inscription, an unaltered one, in a burial that had not been disturbed. And in this particular period, in this particular family, the chances of finding anything unaltered are very poor indeed, because alteration is the defining characteristic of the entire archaeological record they left behind. So even a spectacular discovery might not close the case. It might simply add another contested body to a family tree that is already a battlefield. What would settle it is text. A single unambiguous inscription, from an undisturbed context, naming the female king and identifying her clearly, either as the great royal wife of Akhenaten or as his daughter. That is the object we are actually looking for. Not gold, not a face. A sentence, and sentences unlike gold were exactly what the erasers went after. And let us dwell, before we leave the evidence, on the single strangest object in this whole story, and it is one we have not yet properly looked at: the miniature coffins. Inside Tutankhamun's tomb among the treasures were 4 small golden coffins, each perhaps the length of a forearm, made to hold the internal organs that had been removed from the body during embalming. They are exquisite. They are among the finest pieces of goldwork to survive from the ancient world, inlaid with colored glass and semi-precious stone, each shaped like a tiny mummy with a serene golden face, and the face on them is not his. Scholars looking closely at these coffinettes notice that the features do not match the boy's other portraits, and, more decisively, that the inscriptions inside had been altered. The name that had originally been written there was cut out, and his was cut in, and the name underneath, so far as it can be read, is the name of the female king. So consider what you are actually looking at, if you have ever stood in front of them in a museum or seen the photographs. Those small, perfect golden faces, which millions of people have gazed at and thought were Tutankhamun, may be the face of the woman who ruled before him. They were made for her. Her organs were meant to lie in them, and she never got them. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that, and it is the kind of detail that no amount of theorizing can improve on. The most famous funerary treasure in the history of the world may be, in part, a stolen funeral, and the golden face on the little coffins may be a woman whose name we cannot agree on. And one more small thing, easily missed, and it may be the most useful of all: that quarry inscription. The one that put Nefertiti alive in the 16th year, still holding the title of Great Royal Wife, and rewrote the whole chronology of her disappearance. It was not a monument. It was a working note cut into a rock face by a man doing a job in a limestone quarry, and it survived because it was too small and too obscure and too far out in the desert for anybody with a chisel to bother about. Think about the chain of accidents that had to hold for that to reach us. The man had to write it. The rock had to survive. The erasers had to miss it. 3,300 years had to pass. And then somebody had to walk past and look up and read it and understand what it meant. And that scratch overturned a scholarly consensus that had stood for the better part of a century. That is what the evidence in this field is like. It is not an archive. It is a handful of things that happened by pure accident to escape a deliberate destruction. A chiseled stone in somebody's house, a wine label, a ghost of a name under a boy's cartouche, a note scratched on a rock. Everything we know because the erasers missed something. And that means, and this is the thought to carry out of this section, that they may have missed something else. And there is one last, small, sobering thing to say about the search, and it is about us rather than about Egypt. Every few years, this question comes back into the newspapers, and every time it does, the headline is the same: "They have found Nefertiti." And every time, some months later, quietly, in a journal that nobody outside the field reads, the claim is walked back, and the correction does not make the papers, and the public is left with the impression that she was found. She has not been found, and the reason the cycle repeats is not fraud. It is hope, and it is money, and it is the enormous appetite of the world for a certain kind of story. And it is worth naming that appetite, because it distorts the work. Careful scholars, who say honestly that they do not know, are drowned out by confident ones who say that they do. And over time, the confident voices set the terms of the conversation, and the careful ones sound like spoilsports. So if you take one practical thing away from this long night, let it be this. When you next see a headline announcing that the tomb of Nefertiti has been discovered, wait 6 months. Read what the specialists say after the cameras have gone. That is where the truth is, and it is usually quieter and more careful and less satisfying, and it is the only kind worth having. Now let us step back from the stones and the scans and think in the quiet about what all of this actually means. So we have laid it all out. The altered stone, the feminine ending on a king's name, the epithet that says effective for her husband, the stolen funeral in a boy's tomb, the wine labels counting the years of a reign, and we have laid out the other side too. The quarry inscription that leaves almost no room, the daughters who are equally good candidates, the ancient memory of a king's daughter on the throne. And now, in the deep quiet of the night, let us ask what it all means. Consider first what we have actually established, because it is easy to lose in the back and forth, and it is remarkable. There was a female king of Egypt at the end of the Amarna period. Not a queen, not a regent, a king with a throne name, whose regnal years the estates of Egypt counted on their wine jars, and whose royal name was sometimes written with a feminine ending, because the scribes could not honestly write it any other way. That is not a theory. That is now the position of most of the specialists who work most closely on this material, and it rests on grammar, which is about as solid as evidence from the ancient world ever gets. Let that sink in for a moment. Somewhere in the 14th century before our era, in the collapse of the strangest experiment the ancient world ever attempted, a woman put on the crown of Egypt and ruled, and the men who came afterward went to enormous trouble to make certain that we would never know her name. They very nearly succeeded. What defeated them in the end was a single feminine grammatical ending, added to a royal name on a wine jar label by an anonymous scribe who was simply being accurate, and who had no idea that he was doing the only thing that would ever tell us she had been there. Consider next what the erasure tells us about power and about its limits. Horemheb had every advantage. He had the throne, the army, the priesthoods, the treasury, and time. He had the entire apparatus of the Egyptian state, the most durable administrative machine in the ancient world, and he set it to the task of making these people never have existed. He pulled down their temples, block by block, and carted the blocks away as rubble. He struck their names out of the stone wherever he found them, and he cut their years out of the official lists of kings, so that the reigns on either side of the gap were sewn together, and the wound closed over, as though there had never been a cut at all. And it worked, for 3,300 years. And then, 3,300 years later, men and women with brushes and sieves and notebooks took the whole thing apart again in the space of about a century and put her back. This is not science fiction. This is a documented program of official forgetting, carried out by a state that had every resource it needed and every reason to be thorough, and it failed. And it failed because of a wine label and a chiseled stone in somebody's front room and a note scratched on a rock in a quarry that nobody thought worth destroying. There is a lesson in that, and it is not a small one. Power can destroy the monuments, and it usually does. But it cannot get all the paperwork. It cannot reach into every house and every quarry and every rubbish heap. And so, in the end, the small ordinary traces of daily life outlive the enormous, deliberate lies carved in granite, because nobody with a hammer ever thinks the small things are worth the trouble of destroying. The wine label survives, the temple does not. Consider, too, what this story says about how history actually works. We have spent this entire night unable to answer a simple question. Was it the mother or the daughter? And I want to suggest that the inability is not a failure. It is the point. Because the honest history of the ancient world is full of this, and the confident history is mostly wrong. Every documentary that tells you flatly that Nefertiti became pharaoh is overclaiming. Every book that tells you flatly that she did not is overclaiming too. The evidence does not support either, and a person who is comfortable with that discomfort is closer to the truth than a person who has resolved it. There is a real discipline in being able to say plainly and without embarrassment, I do not know. It is much harder than it sounds. It is far more valuable than it looks. It is very rare in public life and in private, and it is precisely what the best scholars of this period actually do quietly, in the pages of journals that nobody reads. Consider as well the woman at the center of this, whoever she was. She took the crown if she took it in the worst circumstances imaginable. Her husband, or her father, was dead. The heir was a small child. The capital was a city in the desert that could not feed itself. The empire was fraying. and the entire religious and economic establishment of Egypt was massing to tear down everything she stood for. She held it for perhaps 2 years, perhaps 3, not longer, and then she lost, and they took her funeral away from her and gave it to a boy, and they cut her name out of the stone, and she vanished so completely that 3,000 years later we cannot even agree on which woman she was. That is a hard ending. There is no way to soften it, and I am not going to try, because softening it would be a kind of lie, and she has had enough lies told about her. But consider what she did in those 2 years, because it is not nothing. She held the throne. The rituals were performed. The estates counted her years. The kingdom did not fall apart, and there was no civil war that we can see, and when the boy was old enough, the crown passed to him, and Egypt continued. Whatever else she was, whatever her name, she was the hinge on which the kingdom turned in the worst moment it had faced in centuries, and it turned, and it did not break. Egypt came out the other side of the Amarna collapse and went on for another 1,000 years, and somebody held the door open while it did, and nobody thanked her for it. Nobody remembered her. There was no monument, no hymn, no grateful successor recording what she had done in the worst year in living memory. They took her name off the wall, and they took her coffins, and they gave her funeral to somebody else, and they wrote her out of the list of kings as though the years she had held together had never happened at all. Consider before that what this whole question reveals about the fragility of anything we call a record. We tend to assume, without ever quite examining it, that the past is a thing that simply exists, sitting there behind us, waiting to be looked at. It is not. The past is a small heap of surviving objects, and every one of those objects survived for a reason, and the reasons are almost never noble. Things survive because they were too small to bother destroying, because they were buried by accident, because a city was abandoned instead of rebuilt, because a workman scratched a note somewhere nobody was looking. And the things that do not survive are not random either. They are, very often, precisely the things that somebody wanted gone. So the record we work with is not a neutral sample of what happened. It is a heavily edited document, edited by the winners with the most important passages removed. And the historian's job in a case like this one is not simply to read what is there. It is to work out the shape of what is missing, from the shape of the whole. That is what we have been doing all night. We have been reading a whole. And it should make us a little humble about everything else we think we know, because Egypt is not the only place where the winners had chisels. Consider as well what it costs to be a woman in that position, and how carefully we should think about it. There is a very tempting version of this story in which Nefertiti is a heroine, a woman who seized power in a world of men, who took the throne of the greatest kingdom on earth, who broke a rule that had stood for 1,000 years. And there is something in that. If she did it, she did something extraordinarily rare, and something that took nerve. But let us be careful, because the symbol can eat the person. She did not live in our world, and did not think our thoughts. Whatever she did it for reasons we cannot reconstruct, inside a system of belief we can barely follow, in a court where a woman's name could be removed from a monument by a man with a chisel in an afternoon. She had buried at least 3 of her own children. She had watched a religion, and an empire, and a family come apart at once. If she picked up that crown, it was very likely not an act of ambition at all. It was very likely the act of the only adult left standing in a house that was on fire. And here is the deepest trouble with the heroic version, and we should sit with it honestly. We do not actually know that she wanted any of it. We know she was elevated, in image after image over many years. We do not know by whom or at whose wish, or whether she welcomed it, or whether she had any say in the matter whatsoever. It is entirely possible that Nefertiti was raised toward kingship by her husband, and then pushed onto the throne by a faction that needed a figurehead, and then discarded when she was no longer useful. That is also a coherent reading of everything we have looked at tonight, and it is a much sadder one, and nothing in the evidence rules it out. The most honest thing that can be said about the most famous woman in the ancient world is that we cannot tell whether she was an agent or an instrument. And that uncertainty is not a failure of scholarship. It is simply what the evidence permits, and we have to be able to live in it without reaching for a more comfortable story. Consider, too, the peculiar cruelty of what happened to her memory, because it is worth naming. They did not merely remove her. They gave her things away. Her funeral, prepared for her, was taken apart and given to somebody else. Her name was cut off the golden coffins made for her body, and a boy's name was cut in. And that boy, through the accident of an overlooked tomb, became the most famous pharaoh who ever lived. and the treasures made for her have traveled the world under his name, seen by millions, photographed endlessly, and almost nobody looking at them has known that the serene golden face on those little coffins may not be his at all. There is a kind of erasure in that which is worse than smashing. She was not destroyed. She was reassigned. Consider, finally, what has actually survived and what it means. Not her tomb, not her body, not her monuments, which were smashed, not her name in the lists, which was struck out. What survived out of all of it is a face, a painted head, left face down on the floor of a sculptor's workshop, in a city that was abandoned and never rebuilt, buried in the sand for 33 centuries until somebody's hand closed around it. And because of that one accident, the woman they tried hardest to delete is now the most recognizable woman of the entire ancient world. Her face is in millions of homes. People who could not name a single other Egyptian queen know hers. Let that sink in as you drift toward sleep. They chiseled her out of the stone. They pulled down her temples and buried the blocks inside other men's walls. They struck her years from the list of kings so that the record closed over her like water. And of all the hundreds of royal women of ancient Egypt, of every queen who was honored and buried and remembered with every right her people knew, she is the one you remember. Hers is the only face you would know if you saw it. And consider one more thing before we let it all go. What it means that this question is still open. Most of what we say about the ancient world is settled, or is settled enough. The king reigned, the king died, here is his tomb, here are his bones. But this one is not settled, it is live. There are people alive right now, working in Egypt, who may find the object that answers it. There is a real, non-trivial chance that within our lifetimes somebody will read a sentence on a piece of stone, and we will finally know whether the woman who ruled Egypt at the end of the Amarna period was Nefertiti or her daughter. That is a rare thing. Very few of the great questions about the ancient world are still genuinely open. This one is. And yet, and this is what I want to leave you with, the answer would not change the important part. Because the important part is not the name. The important part is what happened. A kingdom at the height of its power tore up its own beliefs and built a city in the desert. That city collapsed in a single generation. A king died, an heir was an infant, an empire was fraying, and a woman took the crown and held it while everything came down. And when it was over, the winners tried to erase every trace of all of them, and they very nearly did it. And they were defeated in the end by a wine label and a scratch in a quarry, and a head left on a workshop floor. That story is true whether the woman was the mother or the daughter, and it is one of the most extraordinary stories that has ever survived from the ancient world, and it survived by accident, against the settled intention of a state that wanted it gone. Now let us come gently to the close, and so we come to the end of our long night together, and to the question we came here to ask, did Nefertiti rule Egypt as a king? Let us give the honest answer, softly, and then let it all go. The honest answer is, we do not know, and we may never know, and here is what we do know. We know that a woman ruled Egypt as a king at the end of the Amarna period. That much is established on the strength of a feminine grammatical ending and an epithet that appears nowhere else in 3,000 years. Effective for her husband. We know she had a royal burial prepared for her with the finest treasures Egypt could make, and we know those treasures were taken from her and given to a boy. We know that on a broken stone in a private house in Amarna, somebody chiseled out the name of Nefertiti and carved a king's titulary into the gap, above a figure that is still unmistakably a woman. And we know that the royal name that female king carried, Neferuaten, had belonged to Nefertiti for years. And we know, too, that Nefertiti was still called Great Royal Wife in the 16th year, with only months to go, and that her daughters bore names that fit, and that an ancient memory speaks of a king's daughter, which Nefertiti was not. Both cases are real, neither one closes, and the woman on the throne stands in the gap between them, unnamed, with the crown on her head, looking at us. Let us go over it one more time, slowly and softly, the way you might turn a smooth stone in your hand before setting it down for the night. A woman married a king, very young, in the richest kingdom on earth, and that king did something no ruler of Egypt had ever done. He turned against the beliefs of his own ancestors, closed the ancient temples, and declared that only the light of the sun disk gave life to the world. And he built a city in the empty desert to hold that belief, and he moved his whole court into it, and she stood beside him. And over the years, in image after image, she was raised, shown at his own scale in crowns no queen had worn, driving a chariot, performing his rituals alone, and at last, on one block of stone, standing over a bound captive with a mace lifted in her hand, in the oldest and most sacred pose that Egyptian art possessed. She bore 6 daughters. She buried at least 3 of them, and one of those deaths was carved on a tomb wall, a mother and a father bent over a child's body, in an image so raw that Egyptian art had no precedent for it. And then her husband died, and the heir was a small boy who was not her son, and the empire was fraying, and the city could not feed itself, and half of Egypt was waiting to tear the whole thing down. And somebody picked up the crown. We know that. We know a woman ruled Egypt as a king in those years, because a scribe wrote her throne name with a feminine ending, and because her royal name carried an epithet that exists nowhere else in 3,000 years. Effective for her husband. We know she had a king's funeral prepared for her, and we know it was taken from her and given to a boy. And we cannot say, with certainty, whether that woman was Nefertiti or her eldest daughter. The evidence points both ways, and honest people disagree, and it may never be settled. Let it settle now, gently, the way the silt settles on the fields when the flood has passed and the water has gone still. Picture her, one last time, whichever woman she was. The city in the desert, white and open, the cliffs standing back around it in a great half-circle, the sun coming up over them in the morning as it had come up every morning of her life. The great road where the chariots used to ride out. The open temples with their hundreds of offering tables in rows, waiting for a light that was about to be taken away from them forever. Picture a room in a palace, and a king lying dead in it, and an empire fraying somewhere far to the north, and a small boy who is not her son, and priests in the old cities counting the days, and granaries that could stop sending grain at any moment, and a crown lying on a table in an empty room, and a woman standing in front of it in the silence, with the light of that terrible morning coming in through the door behind her, and nobody at all left to tell her what to do. We do not know what she thought. We do not know what she felt, or whether she wanted it or dreaded it, or whether anyone gave her a choice at all. We have not one word from her. We have never had one word from her. All we have is what she did next, written in a grammatical ending on a wine jar, and a name chiseled into a household stone, and a golden coffin with somebody else's face on it, and a hole in the record where a rain used to be. She picked it up. Somebody picked it up. And she held it for 2 years or 3, while everything came down around her, and then it was over, and the men with the chisels came in. Picture the city emptying, the court packing up and sailing away downriver back to the old places, the old temples, the old certainties, the doors of the palaces standing open, the sand beginning to blow across the painted floors, across the marshes and the birds and the pools that the artists had laid down, covering them slowly year after year, until there was nothing to see but a low mound in the desert. And picture, in one of those abandoned houses, in the workshop of a sculptor named Tutmosis, a painted head that he did not take with him when he closed the door and walked away for the last time. Picture it falling at some point in some year nobody recorded. Picture it lying face down in the rubble on the floor, and the sand coming in over it, and 33 centuries passing above it in the dark, the empires rising and falling far away, the river flooding and falling, while the head lay there with the red still on its lips. And then, one December morning, a hand reaching down into the rubble and lifting it out into the light. That is the last irony of this story, and it is the one to carry down into sleep. They took her tomb, if it was hers. They took her funeral and gave it to a boy. They took her name off the stone and out of the lists of kings, and they called her husband the enemy and would not write his name. They did everything that a powerful state can do to make a person cease to have existed. And you know her face. You knew it before tonight. You knew it before you ever heard the word Amarna, or the name Neferuaten, or anything at all about a feminine ending on a wine jar. Almost everyone on earth knows that face. It is one of the most reproduced images in human history. That is how completely, how utterly, and how permanently they failed. Let the arguments go now. Let the scans and the theories and the disputes drift away downstream. They will still be there tomorrow, and the scholars will still be arguing. And perhaps one day the sand will give up a sentence, one clear, unaltered sentence, and we will finally know her name. Or perhaps the sand never will give it up, and she will stand in that gap forever, crowned and unnamed, looking out at us across 3,000 years of silence. Either way, it does not matter tonight. Tonight, let there just be the image, the desert bay and the cliffs, the white city with the light falling straight down into its open courts, the tall blue crown that no one else ever wore, the level gaze, and a woman standing in an empty room, in the worst year of her life, reaching out her hand toward a crown. Whatever happened next, whatever her name was, she was there. She was real. She was a person with a body and a voice and a face, standing in a real room on a real morning. She lived, and she buried her children. And she stood in that room, and something in her was strong enough that 3,300 years later, we are still saying her name in the dark. Think, as the night deepens, of how long ago all of this was. 3,300 years. The floods rising and falling on those fields, thousands of times over. The sun coming up over those eastern cliffs every single morning since, on an empty city, on a mound of rubble, on a stretch of sand where a queen once drove a chariot in the light. Such depths of time are hard to hold in the mind, and there is a strange peace in them, if you let there be. Everything that was urgent has stopped being urgent. Every crisis is over. The priests who hated her, the general who erased her, the old courtier who outlived her, the letters from the frontier that nobody answered, the quarrels in the palace, the fear in that empty room, all of it settled long ago into silence, and the river went on flowing north through the desert as it flows tonight, as it will flow tomorrow, and that is a good thing to rest with in the deep part of the night, that the great troubles pass, that the shouting stops, that whatever was unbearable in its moment becomes, in the end, a quiet story that someone tells gently in the dark to help another person fall asleep 3,000 years later, in a language that did not exist when it happened. Let the images stay with you as you drift, soft and dim, the way the last light stays in a room after the lamp has gone out. The white city in its bay of desert, the cliffs standing back around it, the open courts full of offering tables, and the light coming straight down onto all of them at once, the tall blue crown, the level, unhurried gaze, and the painted head lying face down in the dark under a ruined floor, with the red still on its lips, waiting for a hand that would not come for 33 centuries. She has been resting a very long time, wherever she is, and now it is your turn. Let the river carry you now, gently as it carried the boats of Egypt, under the same slow stars that stood over that abandoned city on the night the last people walked out of it and left the doors open behind them. Let the sand settle, softly, the way it settled over that city. Let the lamplight fade, the way it faded in the sculptor's workshop on the last evening anybody worked there. The arguments can wait until morning. The story is told now, the whole of it, as far as anyone can tell it. And the night is deep and dark and quiet around you. And there is nothing left to do, and nothing left to hold, and nothing left to carry into sleep but the image of a woman in an empty room, reaching out her hand. Rest now. Sleep well.